Welcome back to Seeing Wonder, and on this episode, I'll be talking about the design work of The Matrix Resurrections. There wasn't quite as much sci-fi design work as I was hoping there would be in this movie, but there's still at least a few things to go over, and one new ship in particular that I think is pretty cool. And so to start things off, we have a couple of new machines that make an appearance in this movie. This is one of them here. And it's interesting because it has quite a different aesthetic from what we've been seeing from the machines in the Matrix franchise previously. The Sentinels are the most common machine we've been seeing so far, and they have a much more menacing and scary look and feel to them, really insect-like in appearance. We see that definitely with all of these eyes on it, as well as with these a whole series of legs underneath it. And it also has these squid-like arms that it can use as weapons. So overall, you just get an impression that these are pretty dangerous machines that you definitely don't want to be around. And so this new machine borrows a little bit of the characteristics of the eyes from the Sentinels and from some of the other machines we've been seeing. But other than that, it has quite a different look and feel with all of these smooth, rounded shapes to it. And in particular, it has these sort of cat ears on it. It makes the whole thing look kind of cute, like this cute face is looking at Neo here. So it feels a little bit out of place in this world. Later on, when you learn that these machines are the allies of the humans, you can see what they were going for, but it still just feels a bit too cute for me, and it just feels a little bit distracting. And then we see it here as it's lifted up Neo out of his pod, rescuing him and flying off with him. Again, you can see these cute cat ears pretty prominently from this perspective, and the proportion of the head as well when it's so large like this makes it feel almost childlike and kind of add to the cuteness of the whole design. And off to the side here, we've got another one of these friendly machines, but it looks clearly much more insect-like. Here we're seeing it straight from above, so you can just see how round the form is overall. From this shot too, you can see how the human form would kind of fit inside of this. They probably had that in mind with the overall shape so that Neo could neatly fit underneath. It's almost like a sarcophagus shape. And we're catching a glimpse of a new ship that I'm looking forward to talking about in this episode. And here, as we see it dropping Neo on this table, we get a good sense of what it was designed for, to pick up a body. It kind of opens up underneath with these legs and grabs Neo in this case. And the head also lifts up a bit here, as if it had been acting as kind of a shield. But I'm not sure how useful this machine would be for other situations. These forms here with this big head and this big body that doesn't really have a lot of points of articulation other than the legs underneath it. It just feels like it's been designed for one very specific task. And that's totally fair if this machine is here just to rescue Neo, just to complete this one mission. But it doesn't make for the coolest design for a machine if it looks like it can really only do just this one thing, picking up and moving a human body. And this is one of the best shots we get of just sort of the face of the machine here, as it's saying hello again to Neo after he's been rescued, but this time inside of the ship. And again with these cute cat ears. I can't get over it. It's just too distracting. Partly, I think, because the shape is clearly not there for the function. It's just for the aesthetics. And so I think those details were specifically there to kind of soften the appearance, make it look more friendly. But I think they went a bit too far in this case, especially when you see these other two ally machines here in the same shot. And so you can clearly see they didn't go with the same cutesy aesthetic as this machine on the right. And even some of the subtler details, like these seam lines, are helping to highlight and emphasize the shape of the ears. They just bring even more attention to the ears. And one of the characters here, Bugs, is actually heading the machine. And Bugs also says that the name of this machine is Saber, which is also kind of a cute, friendly name. So overall, I find the design it kind of pulls me out of this world of the Matrix. And we've got another cute machine here. This one's name is Kujaku. And I think it's actually a lot more successful than the last machine. But still, this round smoothness and this sort of organic metallic skin. It's almost like the skin itself can move and stretch. Feels very different and a little bit out of place in the world of the Matrix, along with its cute aesthetic. I know I'm saying the word cute a lot, but that really is the best word I can think of to describe these machines. It feels like conceptually it's the cross between a manta ray or some other kind of ray and a bird. So the face of it here feels kind of bird-like with a bit of a beak. It also has these eyes that feel much more either human or animal-like than what we've been seeing with the previous machines. So it has the blue colored ring inside of it, almost like the iris of an eye. And they've even designed it with this impression of an eyelid here as well, which makes it feel even more like an animal. The proportions of the eyes too are quite large. That's another thing that makes a design feel more kind of childlike or cute when you have these oversized eyes. So they're clearly putting an emphasis on the eyes in this design. And it's a way for the characters and the audience to feel a connection with this machine and make it feel more like an animal. It has a really nice, pleasing shape overall, and I like the concept of how it's sort of like a ray flying through the air. Just the way it moves and flies through the air feels really smooth and elegant. And so they've really captured that in the shape of it too. Here's Kujaku landed on Trinity's pod as part of their rescue mission. And so where Saber was the machine that helped rescue Neo, Kujaku is the machine that helps rescue Trinity. And you can see it here as well where, we have these wings and the whole body is kind of flexing and moving. Whereas the machines we've been seeing in the Matrix so far, they look just much more mechanical. And if parts do move, you can see where kind of the joints are and seam lines, and that's where it's getting its movement and its flexibility from. Whereas with this machine, it looks like the kind of the whole body and the wings all flex and bend. But the legs feel a little bit more machine-like with these individual rigid segments. One thing interesting here is where the legs are attached, it almost feels more like the kind of chest level. It's much more far forward than you would see on a bird, and so they kind of feel more like arms. They also remind me a little bit of praying mantis arms, just a lot more smooth and rounded. And so moving on from our adorable robot friends, we've got the new city here called Io. I don't have a lot to say about this one. I do think the concept is really cool. It's like a city built within this giant open cavern underground. And it's like these pillars or columns of rock are holding up the earth above. And then the city itself is sort of built upon those pillars and built within this giant underground space. And I think this sort of cloudy, misty layer at the ceiling at the top is super interesting and a really cool idea. It's almost like they're there to give the citizens of the city the sense that they're not quite living underground. Cool balcony and viewing platform where Neo is sticking out of the rock face here, and then almost spewing out of the opening here. You have all these mechanical components. It's almost like this human technology is growing out of the rock, and there's this blending of their environment and their technology. And maybe the most interesting thing is just how completely different it is from Zion in the previous movies. Whereas Zion had this really heavy industrial feel, and it had this shape where it's essentially just a hollow tube or hollow cylinder going straight down into the earth. It feels a lot more like they're trying to reconnect with nature here and be a part of it. And instead of digging a hole straight into the ground like Zion felt and sort of covering everything with concrete or metal, we see a lot of exposed rock and natural elements here in Io. And then they're also just adding on top of that. You can see on the ground level lots of greenery, as if there's agriculture and maybe even parks, places of leisure within the city. So just a totally different vibe from what we saw in Zion. It's kind of a cool thing about design where you give one person the task of designing an underground city and they might come up with something like Zion, whereas you give someone the same task and they'll come up with something completely different like Io. So I always love to see just different approaches like this and how you can start with a simple idea but come up with completely different results. And next we have something that I think is the coolest piece of design in this movie, and something I wanted to talk about the most, which is this new ship called the Nemesin. It's sort of the counterpart of the Nebuchadnezzar from the previous movies. In the story of the Matrix Resurrections, there's this cooperation between a certain faction of the machines and the humans, which we saw with those friendly robots. But beyond that cooperation, we're also seeing in the design this kind of synergy between machine and human technology. And so this is a great example of that, where the front half, it's more kind of conventional human technology, whereas the back is definitely something much more machine-like, where it's sort of like this machine tail, along with some sort of insect-like legs, has been grafted onto a human ship. I don't know entirely what the function of this tail would be. These things are always made a little more interesting if there is a function to go along with just sort of a cool looking a design or a cool looking aesthetic. But even if the tail doesn't do anything, it looks cool, and I'm okay with that. I always like when a design is something I haven't seen before, and so I just find it a really interesting combination of two different morphologies that create a pretty interesting result. And here we're seeing the Nemesin from the bottom. It's out of focus here as the focus was on the ceiling of Io, but you can still get a good sense of the proportions. You can see how the cockpit section up here is pretty narrow, and then the bulk and the body of the ship makes up most of the mass, with the tail grafted on at the back here finally. And so looking at it from above, we get an even better sense of just what the proportions are like here and the overall shape of it. And here we're seeing the Nemesin straight from the back as it's returning to Io. I find the tail the coolest part, so this is just one of my favorite shots of the ship. I just love the shape of all these segmented, almost like vertebrae here of the tail. And the final piece here has a cool shape as well at the end of the tail. So I just love how everything fits together here. You can clearly see how the tail can be flexible and wave back and forth. And in the same way, the machines we've been seeing so far are clearly inspired by nature. This biomimicry, the Nemesin's tail could be similar to an insect maybe, and each of these vertebrae pieces is almost like a segment of an exoskeleton. But it also reminds me of sort of like the vertebrae of a dinosaur or of a lizard, or it looks like it could even be the scaly tail of a dragon. We also see a ton of these red lights. That's something that's we're seeing is really common with the machine design language. Just a lot of either red lights for eyes or for other kinds of sensors. And the red lights are cool too because they also give your eyes something to track the motion of the tail, especially when a lot of these shots you see it in, there's a lot of darkness. And so having those red lights on the back just help you see the tail even better and see it moving much more clearly. We get a nice shot of the front of the ship here with details of these guns and the cockpit as well. I don't know if every single one of these is supposed to be a gun or a weapon, or maybe some are sensors or something like that. But it's kind of cool to see all this stuff sticking out here. It also feels like we've got this kind of continuous shell or surface, and then the cockpit and the weapons and sensors are kind of emerging from that. One thing that is maybe a bit disappointing is just the cockpit feels a little too conventional here. It feels like I've seen these shapes and this kind of overall design many times before in sci-fi. So I wish they would have done something a little bit more interesting, especially when you compare it to the Nebuchadnezzar, which has a much more interesting and unique bubble window for the cockpit. Here's a tighter shot of the cockpit from the exterior. They probably built a lot of what we're seeing here as an actual set. It looks like maybe this is a seam line here where separates the practical set from the visual effects. So I suspect what I've traced out here is what they would have built as an actual practical set. And so I wonder if that's why the cockpit has sort of a much more conventional look and feel to it. And yeah, it just feels the shapes are just a little too basic for the windows. And overall, the cockpit has a little bit of a boxier feel than the rest of the ship. But everything you're seeing here is much easier to build when it's all made of flat planes. And there are a couple other ships that we only catch glimpses of throughout this movie. There's one in particular that I think has a pretty cool form overall. This one that's closest to the camera here. It looks like it takes a bit of a similar design approach to the Nemesin, where portions of it feel much more kind of human technology, like the front section here. But then it has this interesting middle section that has all of these kind of spiny vertebrae, which look kind of cool. And then it's capped off with this back portion that also feels much more human in design and technology. And it looks like one set of the electrical discs on this ship is actually kind of split in the middle. We can see this line that divides it. And then the bottom half of the disc here is at a little bit of a different angle. So it's a bit of an interesting way to do those electrical discs. And then we've got this third ship in the back that's unfortunately out of focus. And I think it's facing away from us here, but it looks like it has kind of an interesting, unconventional shape here. Again, maybe sort of this insect-like inspiration with a shell on top, and then a smaller body on the bottom where the electrical discs are mounted to it. And then we can just barely see as well. We've got some legs coming down from the body to act as landing gear. So unfortunately, we don't get the clearest shot of that ship, but another interesting ship. And here we see that second ship, but from the back, and we can see some more of those spiny details in the middle section here. It looks like we have kind of a cool framework in the back where these electric discs are mounted to. And here you can more clearly see that split disc I mentioned before. And finally, we see all three ships. The Nemesin is on the left, and the second ship in the middle, and then the smaller third ship on the right, all flying together just before they go in separate ways. And you can see this cockpit section here on the front of the second ship, along with this giant battery of guns on either side, which looks kind of cool. So overall, I like the shape and the details. I always love it when they give these ships at least a few seconds of some nice hero shots to showcase the designs. But unfortunately, we didn't get that with these two ships here. But at least from what I can tell, there's some interesting things going on with them. This is such a cool wide shot of Neo and Trinity's pods that I just wanted to talk about this briefly. I really like how they've used design here to construct such a dramatic shot. You have these huge rings that are getting a little bit smaller as they finally get to Neo's pod here on the left, and the same thing with Trinity's pod on the right. So they figured out a cool way to dramatically showcase these two pods, which are pretty small on their own, but then they have these huge elements behind them that are drawing our focus inwards towards the center of the shot. And then all of these tubes add some really nice details that help bring this whole shot and this whole scene to life. And you can also just barely see Neo's head and arm sticking above the surface of his pod there, which also helps to give a good sense of scale. Whenever there's a human figure in the shot, it immediately gives you a sense of how large or small something is. And some really cool lighting from the top and the bottom, which just helps makes things even more dramatic. And it looks like the size of the details gets smaller at the pods here, and that's another thing that helps draw your eyes to spots you want people to pay attention to. So yeah, just a great dramatic shot. And here we see Neo in his pod, giving you a sense of context of what we were just looking at. And I just wanted to finish on one of the coolest scenes in the entire movie, something we literally only see for just a few seconds, but it's a depiction of this civil war between the machines. We've got these blue machines on the right. These are the ones who have kind of broken away from the rest of the machines and allied themselves with the humans. And then the rest of the machines, the bad machines, are the red ones on the left. And it's scenes like this that leave me wanting more, but I do appreciate just how powerful they are to really get people's imaginations going, wondering what happened during this war and you know how it started, and to get you thinking about and invested in the story and the lore of the Matrix universe. And we've seen some shots like this before in other movies. The Terminator 2 comes to mind when we catch these visions of the future. And also in Star Wars The Force Awakens when Rey touches Luke's lightsaber. And so a very short scene, but it had an impact on me. And there we have the design of the Matrix Resurrections. Not as much sci-fi design as we've seen in the other Matrix movies, but still a few things worth talking about. Thanks for joining me on this one, and we'll see you next time on Seeing Wonder.